Good evening, my name is Oliver Mears and I'm the Director of Opera here at the Royal Opera House, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's Insight, sponsored by Rolex. Tonight I am joined by a panel of opera directors to discuss the role of directors in bringing opera to life on the stage. We'll discuss our journeys into directing, we'll share some highs and lows of the rehearsal room, and we'll ask questions like, what actually is an opera director? We'll have some time at the end of the evening to take questions from the audience, so do have a think of anything you'd like to ask. For now, please help me welcome directors Adele Thomas, Isabelle Kettle and Harriet Taylor. Now, I want to start by allowing yourselves to introduce yourselves briefly. We've got a range of experiences and styles, I think, in the room, and perhaps you can give us a little bit of background, one by one, in terms of your work at the ROH and what you're working on now. Perhaps you might want to start, Adele.
Hello, everybody. My name's Adele Thomas. I am a director. I'm originally from Port Talbot in South Wales, which is a very important thing that you must know about me. And I still live in Cardiff. I think I've been coming back to the ROH for about 6 years now. And today I'm absolutely delighted because I finally found my way from red core to green core for the first time on my own, which I'm very proud of. And I started, we did one of the first shows in the new Limbury redesign. I was very lucky that I met Ollie when Ollie was running Northern Ireland Opera, and he gave me my first opera. And then I directed Berenice at the Limbury, which was great fun, and then came back to do Bajazet at the Limbury as well. And did something here in the lockdown as part of the 4-4 programme, and just did a co-production of my Trovatore with the Royal Opera House and Opera House Zurich. And that's me, I think, in a nutshell.
Isabelle.
Hi, everyone. So my connection with the Opera House is that I joined as a Jette Parker Young Artist in 2019 and was the young artist actually over COVID. And that's how Harriet and I also met. Before Harriet became, well, I'll let you tell your own story. But I think I had started directing some opera before I got that job, but actually not very much. I directed a tiny opera for pop-up opera at Grimebourne Festival at the Arcola, and I'd done a kind of outdoors Dido and Aeneas, but that was it. And then I got this job, and I'd only been doing theatre before then. And since then, that's really kind of really opened the doors and kind of sent me on that path, and I have really loved it. And since being a young artist, I've come back various times as an assistant director and a revival director here. But now I'm freelance, and I think that's.
And Harriet.
As Izzy alluded to, I had my first job here at the Opera House assisting on Izzy's Young Artist show. Prior to that, I was part of a scheme that the Jette Parker program ran for theater directors who might have transferable skills to entice them into the opera pipeline. And so I did that training with Katie Mitchell and Elaine Kidd for about a year, and then worked with Izzy. That was my first job in opera. And shortly thereafter, joined the Jette Parker program, which I am now currently on. That consists of assisting on a lot of main stage projects, occasionally directing stuff for the learning and participation folks, and then directing in the Limbury. But yeah, prior to that, I'd been a theater director and actually a musical theater performer prior to that, so very sort of delighted and surprised to find myself in this world now, but I like it very much.
And why directing in general? I'm asking all of you. First come, first served.
I grew up in a very working class background, but what we had, and I won't ask any questions about how this happened, was cable television, which I'm sure fell off the back of a lorry. And I used to be obsessive about watching MTV. And what I loved about MTV was that the music videos were storytelling through music. Because I was obsessive about music, I was obsessive about fine art, and I went to youth theatre, and I knew I didn't want to be an actor. And if you're from Port Talbot, then being an actor is weirdly a strangely popular job. Because it's one of the places, it has a strange history of exporting incredible Hollywood actors like Richard Burton and Anthony Hopkins. So every mum in Port Talbot knows how to get their kid into RADA. It's like number one. And then second, they know how to get into the steelworks. But I knew I didn't want to be an actor, but I wanted to be an artist of some sort. And I knew I was fumbling around for a long time thinking, if I could marry art and performance and music, then that would be brilliant. And of course, I just had no idea that opera existed until I was in my 20s, really. And when I first saw my first live opera, I kind of went, oh, this makes a lot of sense. But it took me a very long time to get into it. But I want to know how you two kind of got into it.
So I graduated from NYU, where I had studied musical theater, and was trying to work for maybe 6 months on and off Broadway, and realized that I absolutely, I felt no agency. I got told I thought too much all the time. I really I didn't think they wanted me and I didn't want them. So I actually moved here to undertake an MA at RADA. But the subsidized theater economy here seemed like it offered so many more opportunities to see a future for yourself in the arts that wasn't performing. In New York and in the sort of commercial musical theater world, the only pathway that I was sort of aware of was that of being a performer. But moving here and meeting people I really wanted to collaborate with, and there being schemes at producing houses to sort of give you the skills you needed, not unlike the Yetta Parker program, is what sort of showed me that directing was even an option. And it's been wonderful.
Izzy?
Well, I grew up basically doing made-up games and putting on plays all through my childhood, and I never thought of directing as a career ever until I was about 22, actually. And I actually loved acting, and yeah, it never occurred to me, but I realise now I was the one in all those made-up games that was sort of saying, no, we've got to keep playing for another hour, and everyone else wanted to stop, and we'd make our parents sit and watch, and it kind of, now sort of looking back, it makes a lot of sense. And then I did my GCSE work experience actually as an assistant stage manager for a production of Marlowe's Edward II in Holborn Crypt. And I just remember I've never been so happy going anywhere. I would commute, on the... Yes.
You were either going to be a mortician or a director.
Exactly. And I chose the right path.
It's good money in being a mortician, I think.
Yeah, probably better, actually.
Probably.
And I just felt so excited and enthused to be there in the rehearsal room. I think the rehearsal room is actually where I really fell in love with directing.
I mean, one of the things that people who go to the opera or go to theatre aren't necessarily always 100% clear on is what a director actually does. So how would you guys define what a director is, what a director does? For those people who might think they know nothing about the role, they just see it in the programme.
Oh, even people who think they know what directors do really don't know what a director does.
Yeah, I often find on the first day of rehearsal, I'm like, oh my God, what does a director do again? But I have a friend, I will steal for a second from a friend of mine who's a director in New York, and she often describes directing as essentially party planning in a different guise, which is essentially, you're kind of you're at the helm of a big ship, you're thinking about audience experience in some ways, maybe like wedding planning, you're like telling a story, you're trying to reveal some kind of truth, but essentially, I mean, I think it's a strange thing because it's got two elements. It's got the fact that you're the helm of a ship and you actually have to employ a lot of different skills to essentially look after an enormous team and guide everybody and also enable everybody to sort of reveal their best work, but also you're trying to unearth some core story that you believe in at the heart of it. So, which I guess is like any art form, you have the story or the thing you're trying to get to, but also then the skills and the tools that you have to employ to do it. And in directing, those skills are pretty vast and complex, I would say.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I asked this to a conductor I was working with last week because I just kind of wanted a perspective outside of my own, neuroses. And because of course there's entirely a world where opera singers could turn up and the conductor could conduct them and they could work out where they're going and what they're doing. And he said something really interesting, and he said, well, if you do something like Verdi's Macbeth, for example, then there are multiple paths that you can take through that piece. It could be a piece about revenge. It could be a piece about tyranny. It could be a piece about lineage without an heir. It could be an opera about Scotland. You know, it could be an opera about Italy. The director's job is to find a path through that woods, and then to ensure that every single person and every single member of the team is taking the same path together. Because the production of that same opera, if every opera singer is kind of doing whatever they want, would be a complete and absolute mess. In the way that a conductor cannot function without a conductor. You know, can you just imagine the chaos if you're trying to coordinate singers and an orchestra together? Well, the director's job is to set the path and to say to everybody, okay, the way through this is we are going to make this about these things, and therefore everything we do needs to feed in. And then I think there are as many different processes and ways of making that happen as there are directors, quite frankly, because every single person works completely differently. Some people will scream at everybody to get them to do it, and they might make fantastic work, and I'm not saying that I like that approach, but you know, the work might be brilliant. Some people might be incredibly nurturing and work very collaboratively, or be very light touch and barely do anything. Everybody has a completely different process, I think.
Harriet.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think I'm still on the journey of kind of figuring out what an opera director does as opposed to perhaps a theater director. But I think at its core, the bits of it that matter to me are pretty much the same, which is just, you know, the director's the person who wants to or is willing to hold space that is safe and productive and whatever enough so that the people inside it can each do their jobs, whatever that show calls for. I think most of what I spend time doing, especially lately, is just sort of like keeping certain things out and certain things in and just holding the space with as much kind of love but also authority as possible to make sure that the people in it can do what they know they're there to do.
You allude there to the difference between opera directing and theatre directing, and Adele, you've done quite a bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you see as the essence of the difference between those two different forms of directing?
I stopped directing theatre. Okay, this is where I'm going to start to get a bit controversial. And this does not apply to all actors, but I stopped directing. I know everyone's already like, okay, come on, tell us. I stopped directing theatre because I felt like, actually, another friend of mine put it brilliantly, where they said theatre has become smaller than life. And I thought that was really interesting. There's something about the way the theatre was being influenced, something about actors' imaginations, which I saw over the course of a 15-year career as a theatre director, becoming quite small, quite natural, quite televisual. And it didn't interest me, because my interests have always been in hyper-theatricality. I think now theatre performance is incredibly subtle. And if that's what you love to do, that's great, but it's not my cup of tea. And I love the hyper-theatricality of opera, always did. And I think as a theatre director, I was always smuggling in music. And when I worked as a theatre director, I ended up working with tons of music. I worked with a rockabilly band on a show. I worked with choirs. I worked with the English Concert on a show at the Globe. I worked with rock stars. You know, I worked with a kind of whole gamut of different musical performers anyway within theatre. So I think opera was inevitable. But the interesting difference, I think, and this is a kind of negative difference for opera, is I think that there's a lack of curiosity of process in opera, which I'm at the moment I'm starting to interrogate why we aren't more creative with the process. There's lots of brilliant stuff about the process in opera. The rehearsal days are very set. And that's good, I think, for everybody. The technical rehearsals are spread out over a longer period and they're shorter, and I think that's brilliant. Opera appeals to my desire to pre-plan everything to within a millimetre of its existence. We were talking about control freakery earlier on. And I like the length of time that you develop an opera. It gives you a lot of time to really think about something and develop a very deep relationship with the piece. Theatre can be a bit more quick in the turnover. But that lack of curiosity and process, I think, is really interesting. And at the moment, because the process of making opera is very, very set. And it's based around the availability of the orchestra, it's based around the availability of the chorus, and it's based around music at the heart of the process, which to some degree is as it should be, but I think that there's room to explore in opera more flexibility of how the process of rehearsal happens. And in theatre, your rehearsal process, because you have a bit more time and a bit more breathing space can very much be tailored to whatever you need the show to be. But in opera, I think opera rewards coming in and kind of being fast and furious in the way that you make something, which I like. But sometimes I just think, I wonder if there's room to interrogate a different process of making the work.
Isabelle, when you sit down or stand up or do whatever you do when you're working on an opera for the first time, how do you set about it? What's your starting point?
Yeah, I think I ask myself that every time I approach a new piece, and I kind of wonder, and it remains in some ways as nebulous to me as it ever did. And I think because what I have tried to do more and more, and it's actually one of the reasons I really love working in opera as opposed to theatre, is that I have tried in recent years to come from a more intuitive place actually, and be able to move at first instance away from my analytical brain. And I think that I have tried processes where I sit down and I think, okay, what's the concept going to be? And how are we going to do it? And what's the slant? And it actually has never gone well for me that way. And I've always thought, no, you've missed something. And I think what I try and do now is, so actually what I do when I start the process is probably walk and listen to it. And that's why I love it also, because you're not just sitting with your brain reading a script. You can listen, and you can, through the music, actually develop a pretty intuitive response. Obviously, having read the script, especially if it's in a different language, like you have to know what they're saying. But I think that's normally where it starts for me, is trying to get into an intuitive response. Yes, because like what you were saying, which is so beautifully described, this kind of mapping the path through the woods, and especially with a lot of the opera canon, the paths have, many paths have been mapped before.
Yeah.
And it can be so easy to think, right, I've got to think of something new or something meaningful, and sometimes that actually means you miss a deeper emotional point, perhaps, or something kind of truer.
The question of intuition is a very interesting one. I mean, I know a very distinguished director who shall remain nameless, who participates in recreational drugs in order to get inspired.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say who it is. You have to guess.
Find out later.
But how do these ideas filter down for the first time if you're not using recreational drugs?
Maybe we
I
are.
hope you're not. Don't do this at home, kids.
I think it's a bit like the Chinese tradition of looking at a white wall and letting, for me, that's what it feels like. I mean, I spent such a long time with the score. I'm obsessive about the music, to within like if I can't find an answer to like a bar of music in an opera, I will scrap the whole idea and start again, because I think that really for me is the kind of key to it. But it's a bit like looking at a white wall for long enough that the story kind of comes to you. That's certainly what I think happens to me, if that makes sense. But it'll be different for everybody. And I'm becoming a bit more renegade about kind of not listening to what other people say about the piece, because I think one of the issues with opera is the well-trodden path. The first opera I made for you at Northern Ireland, for example, me and Hannah, who designed it, I think we have a Pinterest board which I think has about 26 different kind of concepts on it, because everything, when you think you have the eureka moment and you go, oh great, we've got a great idea, someone else has done it. And so you have to go, right, start again, until you can find something that you've never seen before with the piece. And that was a long process and really frustrating process. And it got to the point, I think, where we went to a bar, and I think I drank about 4 pints of lager and Hannah drank a shandy, very civilized manner. And I just kind of went, this is a disaster, we can't do it. And then it was weirdly at the point at which we were falling apart that we just immediately had this idea, which then all came together in about 10 minutes after 2 years of work, kind of hammering away at something. But yeah, I think that process of just letting it kind of emerge for me is very important. What about you?
I feel quite interested in text still, and maybe as I work more and more, especially on work that is a bit more prominent in the canon, the stuff that I'm working on now might as well be new work because it's so rarely performed. But story and storytelling is very important to me, and that might be as a result of training as a director here in the UK, where I think the playwright and authorship is very important and very sacred in kind of theater practice here, as opposed to maybe a more sort of director-driven German theater or devising heavy American theater. I think the sanctity of text here is something I respond really well to, and so you know, if it's The Barber of Seville, I'm reading the original play, or if it's the piece I'm working on now, I'm back in Yeats, like reading poetry. For me, it's something about tapping back into what is the story that we were trying to tell when we employed music to help us do that, and somewhere in there is usually where I feel rooted and inspired.
I think the question of text is an interesting one. I've had a recent experience directing a piece that's not done that often, La Gioconda, which is based on a Victor Hugo play, which is even less known than the opera. And for me, getting to know the play, which was very, very different to the libretto, and particularly reading one single line in the play unlocked a whole idea for the show. So often going back to the original source material can be hugely worthwhile, I think.
I was when I revived Otello here, and I really found myself wondering what is, especially with a Shakespeare, you know, where you know that the text is so thrilling and so brilliant and so dense, and the opera cannot contain all of that text, but then of course it is conveying so many of those ideas through musical ideas, and it's being able to listen for those as well. But I found that a kind of, an interesting balance to try and strike.
And of course it is a team game, isn't it? Directing, you need a team around you, and you alluded to your conversations with Anna Clark and how useful those can be in generating ideas. I guess it's the same for you guys, Isabelle and Harriet, the importance of the team.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think with finding a design, you know, I think the director-designer collaboration is actually a core. Maybe we should actually be sitting here with the designers as well, because you can't do it alone. And you would never want, I mean, I guess some people do both roles. I think I would find that really hard, mostly because I think I need the other person to make me better, and then we can keep trying to make each other better. But I do think I really recognise that situation where you are just beating your heads against the wall and you've talked and talked and you can't get at the thing, and this idea doesn't work, that doesn't work, and you can't work it out, and then it is somehow amidst that fog that there's always the moment just at the point of despair. But what is so frightening about that is you can't control the moment where it happens.
No, and despair is part of the job, sadly.
Yeah.
I think the fundamental thing about being a director is actually it's really lonely. It's a strange thing, because I think the assumption is that you have all this power and that you're very in control of everything, but actually you're on your own, and the director is kind of held responsible for everything. So if a singer does something completely rogue, you get blamed for it. Likewise, if someone's done some beautiful work in the show that wasn't you, then you get the credit for it. It's deeply unfair, but it's quite lonely. And so I think the team that you put around yourself is kind of, it's not just about skill, it's about, is this a person that I can sit in Zurich or Berlin with on an afternoon where we both feel like this is going horrendously wrong, and how are we going to solve this? Is this someone that I can share the vulnerable parts of myself with, as well as someone who's going to kind of understand me when I say, oh, you know, it needs to be a bit more squeezy, and that they'll kind of understand, they'll translate what that means into design somehow. So it's a really fine balance. And I do find that I work with a couple of the same people a lot, because we speak the same language almost intuitively. And I think I would find the process quite strange and strained if I had to do it through the prism of, oh, you don't quite get what I mean, and I have to try and translate what I mean to you all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Personally, I don't actually find directing so lonely, because you're in a rehearsal room with fantastic singers and musicians and the conductor, and as you said, being surrounded by your team as well, and you know, you can go through all of the different problems or solutions that you need to work through with the team. Whereas I always imagine that the life of a composer or the life of a playwright, that really is solitary.
But they're weirdos, so they like it.
Harriet, do you have any reflections on this aspect of things?
I have collaborators that I've loved having relationships with in theater. I haven't found that in opera yet, but in theater it's definitely been a factor of us having the same taste, and like you said, sharing a language around that taste. And so, but it's a weird one. I think I've heard directors who haven't found that Vicky Clark or whoever pine for the idea of like that designer who would get me and like know what the inside of my brain looks like and be able to put it on stage. And I've also worked with people like Anthony McDonald, who does design his own shows, and so is just whole in that way. I think I don't think there's a wrong way, and I feel hopeful that even if I weren't to find a designer, that gelled with, that, like you've just said, Ollie, like you can feel supported by the people around you if you allow them to support you.
Guys, when you're conceiving your opera productions, do you feel the weight of the canon? The fact that this is a repertory which is, in some ways, quite solid. It's not as fluid, and often the pieces aren't as recent as we would always like. And particularly with the pieces that we know best, there is this weight of tradition there. As you alluded to, there are all these productions that already exist.
Yes.
And how do you negotiate that when you're
I think
directly a
something you said
well-known
about
piece?
finding that line or that sentence that is your spark is really important. And I'm getting to a stage where if I can't find a way through something and I don't believe in it and I don't feel like I can, however canonical and terrifying it is, then I don't really want to do it for the sake of doing it. But it is really interesting. There's a pattern there's a kind of layer of stuff around opera. And I think of all the art forms, it suffers the most, I think, from a beautiful, and I understand why, a beautifully protective kind of protection of the conventions and the history of it. And I was talking to someone earlier on today, and I said, sometimes it can feel a bit like you've written The Lord of the Rings, and there are lots of people out there who are total Tolkien geeks, and they have a lot of opinions on how things should be done. And the truth is that there's no right way to do opera. There's no one way to do it. And I think I love those people who appreciate opera and adore it, but if it ever starts to get policed, I think that's deeply problematic. Because actually there are millions. I mean, it's interesting because you were talking about Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. We can totally appreciate in the UK a new take on a Shakespeare play because I think we feel culturally confident in Shakespeare as our cultural export. So therefore it can take a bit of flexibility. But I'm not sure that the UK has ever sat entirely comfortably with opera. I think even from the minute of arriving here from Italy, we felt a little bit askance from it. And I think when we're truly confident in the fact that we are brilliant, there is so much incredible British opera, and we are an international powerhouse of opera in some ways, I think then there'll be a bit more flexibility for new ways through it. So I try not to kind of feel the weight of it, but rather a kind of responsibility to kind of look at something and to tell the story from a slightly different angle, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And as younger directors, you're young directors, do you feel that there is a pressure to be experimental, or a pressure to be avant-garde, or to say something about the piece that's almost different for the sake of it, or not? I mean, is that something that you're conscious of when you develop a piece?
I think there's probably always pressure on any director at any point in some, one way or the other about how they're going to interpret something. I think, and a little like what I think you'll probably also come in for flack from either side if you go hard on one side, hard on the other. And I have really been reflecting on that recently. I definitely went through a phase, especially early in opera directing, but also when I was studying theatre, and I kind of wanted to completely, throw out the canon, or completely do a complete slant on every single canonical play, and, completely sort of break it open. But now I'm in a space where I'm sort of wondering, is that really a kind of inside-out authentic response? And I still remember a friend saying, well, why don't you just then only do work by contemporary writers? If you're so busy hating the canon. She really had a point. And I think I subsequently I find that the directors that inspire me the most, but also I think the way the work can be the best is where you're trying to really unearth something that is there in the piece, that is not that you let go of the tradition, but you find through kind of close listening and attention something true that already exists in it. And naturally, I'm trying to trust that I will bring any of my own politics or contemporary, that will come naturally. And I think in the past, when I've tried to do too much of something kind of really superimposed, it actually hasn't felt on a very deep level totally authentic. But I also think that we talk about historical change. You need the kind of really the
Progress.
different degrees. You need grassroots activism, but you also need the slow legal change. You know, you need all of it. And I think maybe in opera, it's the same is true. You need the people who are going to be doing the kind of complete rewrite of the thing, and it all, you know, disgusts everyone. And you need the people who do the super traditional. And then you need everything. And maybe you're right, you know, maybe we need to trust that it can weather
absolutely
all of those things.
I think that's right. When we feel confident about it as an art form, we're not panicking about our relationship to it. I think we will allow it to have... I mean, the interesting thing is, like, the Arts Council of England, you know, famously said a couple of years ago that more opera should be made in car parks, for example.
And on your phone. And
on your phone. And as someone who lived in an industrial town made of concrete, and I adore it, I would rather not spend some time in a car park. Spend enough time in car parks. There's something about that idea which, yes, I'm sure there is a production out there which is the perfect show to set in a car park, but you can't force something into a parameter where there's no meaning for it. I made a big show in Portalba called The Passion in Portalba. I was one of the people who made that. It was a huge community project with 2,000 people in the cast, and Michael Sheen kind of led it, and he was, took over the whole of the town. And that worked because of Michael's relationship to the town, because the town's story hadn't been told. But that is not a model that will work for every show. Neither will just following the same things that we did mean that another show would succeed in that way. We have to think about the reason, if we're taking something out of an opera house, the reason for it being out of the opera house needs to be so well thought through and so meaningful to the heart of the piece, you know, which is basically anything directing, you have to do the same thing, I guess.
And the other important relationship in the room, of course, is between the director and the conductor. Tell us about your experiences of that and how important it is. Maybe, Harriet, you could start with that.
It strikes me as very important. They have a taller seat than you, and a special name, Maestro. And I think if you go into that relationship expecting it to be animus or one where you are at odds with each other, you will probably self-fulfill that prophecy. There are probably also people who will be difficult, but actually the processes I've observed here have illuminated the way that at their core, conductors are interested in the music's ability to tell story. And so as long as there's a kind of mutual respect for the fact that we're each going to look after slightly different parts of this, but we're trying to serve, you know, the same good, that it can be spectacular. I mean, watching you and Tony Pappano on Trovatore was, like, beautiful. It didn't seem like any of sort of those horrible examples of those roles being animus. And certainly in working on the Lindbury show I'm working on now, Edward Reeve, who's also a young artist, you would never know that there's sort of any stereotype like that. He's as engaged and interested in the music participating in the storytelling that we're all ultimately there. But I'm sure there are horror stories. Well,
Tony Pappano has famously said that an ideal scenario in an opera rehearsal room is a conductor who's got a theatrical instinct and who cares for theatre, and a director who is a natural musician. But of course that's not always the case, is it? I mean, I'm sure you've had experience.
I had one experience with the conductor who's so... I mean, everyone wanted to kill him. He just had so little theatrical instinct that it would, and no matter what you did, it would just kill it instantly. And that is, it's awful. It's really horrifying. And everyone tried to get him fired as much as possible, but we went to no avail. But it was a killer.
I hope he's not watching tonight.
I'm not going to say who or where, but then people like Tony and Lawrence Cummings, who I've worked with a lot, you know, they are truly brilliant conductors, and the reason that they're truly brilliant opera conductors is because they are born dramatists. And in fact, the other thing I was thinking about earlier on is, funnily enough, like I worked with Tony on a Verdi, and I worked with Lawrence on a lot of Handel, and Verdi and Handel were the original directors of their own material. I think something that gets lost a lot in the history and the way that tradition, which tradition is a word that is totally meaningless, there's no such thing as tradition, you know, but they were coming at those pieces as directors and as composers. And I think over time, both of them, especially Verdi, has come to be known as, you know, this great musician, and everything's about the singers, and Caruso said, all you need to do Trovatore is the 4 best singers in the world. And then you read Verdi's letters to his singers and to his partners, and all he writes about is the libretto, the way people are acting, the fact that he needs an azucena who can act as well as sing, that he's, so it's I think we need to rethink a lot of these operatic composers, not purely as musicians who are hermetically sealed off from everything in the world, but actually Verdi and Handel being two examples of impresarios who are looking around at the theatre ecology at the time, who are looking at the popular culture at the time, who are in competition with other theatre, who are keen dramatists, and who I think prioritise drama in their operas more highly than we would automatically assume from watching their operas today.
So in an opera rehearsal room, director, conductor, who's in charge?
The assistant director.
Well, no, I think that you know the time and the place, because there are some. I mean, that it's perhaps a boring answer, but that there are some rehearsals that everyone knows.
Talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Oh, well, the sort of literal thing about it, I suppose, is that often in a rehearsal process you'll have a day or 2 days of music calls, and then you'll have technically the rehearsals that are considered the staging rehearsals. And of course, every conductor, which are run by the director, but every conductor and director, you might have a quiet conversation and say, we'd love to do 20 minutes of the music at the beginning of this rehearsal. And if that relationship is going well, the director will hopefully say, yes, of course, that would be lovely. And you do occasionally see moments where you agree 20 minutes and then it's 45 minutes have gone past and the director's looking quite stressed, but I think it's a kind of give and take. And then but it's considered, I would say, staging, which is the director's room. And then once you move to stage, you have stage and pianos, which are the director's rehearsal, and then stage and orchestras, which are the conductor's rehearsals. So I think in some ways it's actually very clearly delineated, but then of course within it, you're always having conversations all the time, in the best relationships.
Mm-hmm. Is that your experience as well, Adele?
Yeah, I think, it's funny, I remember an experience working with Gianandrea Nozeda at Zurich when we first did Trovatore, and we were doing the stage and pianos, and of course every day at the end of the session I'd be like, Gianandrea, are we doing okay? And he'd be like, yes, it's fabulous. And then I thought he's such a big, he's such a confident guy and he's so marvellous, and I thought I'm constantly looking for him to just tell me it's all okay. And then at the end of the stage and orchestra, he was like, Adele, is it okay? So I think, when you can acknowledge that everyone, of course, has got their own, of course, if everyone cares, even if everyone cares deeply about the production and they're on an equal footing, collaborative, there's always going to be that thing where, the conductor's going to worry a bit more about whether the orchestra sound together or not. But, and you're absolutely right that I think if you're both respectful to each other's jobs. I'm very respectful of the music and I want it to sound incredible, so I'm not going to tread on the conductor's toes. So I think you just have to have a real understanding that everyone is, they're just desperately vulnerable and hoping to protect their own thing. And then if you understand that, then, you can make anything work.
And the best moment is, when a conductor might say, but hold on, what about that bar
exactly.
there? There's something there that you're not making sense of, and you're not doing anything with that. And of course, that makes you better because you're like, oh yeah, I didn't spot that.
Yeah.
And that is a theme from this, and you have an idea suddenly, and it gets better.
Yeah. And I guess that slightly relates to the whole question of conductor attendance, because we're very lucky in this building that Tony Papano wants to be there from the very first day of rehearsals and then is deeply involved in the process all the way through. But not every conductor is like that.
No, and I think ultimately my position on this is I think it shortchanges the audience more than it shortchanges everything else, because when the conductor is in the room with you, you can get everything to click into position in a way that's truly electric and extraordinary. And when they're not, I think there's always going to be a strange back and forth between the people on stage and the pit, no matter how brilliant the conductor is. And I think conductors should bloody well be in the rehearsal.
Yeah, I agree totally. I also think it's not fair on the singers, actually,
I agree,
because often the director might work to talk through an idea and an interpretation, and then if a conductor hasn't been there to kind of participate
Yeah.
in that. They might suddenly show up very last minute and say, hold on, you're singing this all wrong.
Yeah.
And then the singer gets completely stuck in the middle.
If it was to do a process and there was a reason why they had to be there last minute, I would understand it. But generally it's because they just want to do as many gigs as possible and make a load of cash. And I don't think that's a good enough reason. Or at least they should share the money or something. You know?
Harriet, what have your experiences been in this area?
I have only actually really worked in opera in this building, so I'm realizing the more I hear about what it's like out there in the Wild West, that I've got it really good here. I've witnessed some really holistic, healthy, collaborative processes. Please don't make me leave.
Let's talk a little bit about performers and singers in particular, and how important developing a relationship with the singers in the room is in terms of your directing, and the skill set of a director seems to be, to me, intimately connected with that. Who wants to talk about that first, that relationship with singers?
I love them. I think I remember enough what it was like to be a performer that I have a ton of empathy for what's at stake for them, and more so than many other performers I've ever seen, opera singers are like athletes. It's the caliber of sort of what they're asked to be able to do with their bodies, like the amount of sound they can make, the amount of stamina that requires. Before working in opera, was maybe aware of stereotypes about singers being, the word diva and how it sort of devolved into something other than, lovely genius performer.
Yeah.
But actually, the more time I spend around singers, the more I think, they're the one whose body is precarious. Like, they're the one who have to walk out on that stage and feel safe and feel like you set them up to succeed. And I've also, seen ones who are difficult, but at the same time, I have a lot of space for it. I think about in film, there's heads of department for everything, like your lighting and your sound and your production design and whatever. And when you yell cut, I heard a director once say that like all those HODs are going to run to their department. The actors are your department. Like, that's the people that you should run to as soon as you yell cut, to check in with them and see how they're doing, because no one else's priority is them. Everyone else has their sort of department and their things that they're supposed to consider. But as the director, the reason I like the job so much is because the people that I need to consider are the performers. So I feel a lot of like affection for them.
Yeah.
And how do you get the best out of singers?
I think you have to build serious amounts of trust with them, and especially with a lot of these singers who I think I've grown in respect for the fact that you might come in and, I might come in as a young director and have this big idea for this, whatever, but they may have sung, especially on a high level, top level, they may have sung this role in 20 different productions, and they have a lot of experience to bring to it, but they also maybe just sort of are kind of passed through the mill a bit, and I think you have to, trust on both sides, and goodwill at the beginning is probably really important. But I think, feeling like sort of taking care of them as much as anything. But also, that's why also developing a concept you can really get behind and feel sure of, that doesn't feel, if you're clear about that, then you can easily, I think, get a singer on side. And always there will be ways where it's difficult, or they don't really understand something, or you might be asking for something and they just can't, it doesn't feel right for them. But I think if you've developed the trust early, then often you can find your way through that. But I think trust and talking, but not too much talking, sometimes just doing, is also useful.
Adele?
Yeah.
I tend to ask quite a lot of my singers, especially physically. We did a show this time last year where we basically retrained some singers in contemporary dance, and then they performed with a dancer while doing these really complex Handel cantatas. And I did that because I really wanted to test how far I could push singers physically. And like Berenice we did here was like, people cartwheeling and doing coloratura and whatever. So I'm very aware that I'm asking a lot of them. There are two things. I know the music back to front. I can sing you the entire score from beginning to end. I want to know, I think knowing the music really helps you win the trust of singers, because I think they're quite used to. Someone told me a horror story where a director turned up with the libretto from the CD booklet.
It's the first thing they teach me.
And they were directing from that.
Yeah.
And apparently there was a fantastic story that someone said they had a 15-minute rehearsal on the first scene of La Boheme, because the director said, "Oh, it's only a line. You come in, you say, can I have a light?" And then you leave. And she said, "Yeah, but I sang that for 14 minutes." And they had no idea. So I think if you know the music inside out, I think that's automatically really good. But because I do kind of demand a lot from them, one thing I nicked from theatre to opera is I contact them before rehearsals. Because I still can't get my head around this, but a lot of opera singers will turn up on day one of rehearsal and they will never have met the director. They weren't cast by the director, they'll have been cast by the opera house. And they will have no idea of the concept they're about to walk in. And a singer I just worked with, I bumped into him about a month before we started rehearsals, and he was starting rehearsals for something completely different. And I said, "Oh, it's your first day, how are you feeling?" And he said, "Well, I don't know if I'm going to be naked on stage or if I'm going to be wearing a wetsuit. I've got no idea." So I try really hard to have a really deep conversation with them before we start rehearsal, so that they have a sense of what they're doing. If they are going to be moving a lot, then they've got time to go to the gym. But also, then they come in on day one and they feel a bit more on top of what they're doing.
Yeah, conversely, I know from some experience that singers can be a bit surprised if you reach out and to have that advanced conversation.
Yeah.
They think that you're going to ask them to do something completely outrageous.
Totally. But then they're really delighted when you just go, "I'm just asking you to do a cartwheel." They're like, "Oh, God, I thought you were going to, make me kind of do cartwheels and get completely naked."
Yes.
I was like, "We will do that, but don't worry, I won't tell you about that yet."
What about examples of where it hasn't gone quite to plan with performers? You must all have one or two stories.
Yeah.
You don't have to name names.
Oh, why?
You can do.
This is why I did this. It was in theatre, but one of the first shows I did when I was a very, very young director, like these two ladies here, there was an actor in that who was so vile to everybody that I there and then made a policy where I said no more arseholes in rehearsal room, and that is a fundamental rule of my rehearsal rooms now, that there are no. I don't care how talented you are. If you are difficult, if you're going to make other people's lives difficult, I don't want you in my rehearsal room. And I always Dominic Dromgoole used to run the Globe. He did something fantastic every season. Sorry, I'm giving Dominic's secrets away, but he would at the end of every season he would have tea with the wardrobe department, and he would have a list of every single person who'd worked at the building that season, and they'd go through every single name, and if those ladies in the wardrobe department said that that person had been a nightmare to them, they're not coming back.
Wow.
Because if someone's been terrible to wardrobe, it's guaranteed that they are real handful.
Yeah.
So yeah, that just scarred me for life, and I thought there's no amount of talent that warrants having that level of difficulty in the room.
Izzy, Harriet?
I think when I was younger and I was still studying, I had this really kind of, it sort of shocked, this experience where we were making something that was in a kind of collaboration class, and I think I was so busy trying to show that I knew what I was doing and I had ideas, and I found out afterwards, because we all had to do this feedback, that one of the actors, and he was just like, "You left no space for me, none whatsoever," and I actually think, and he was really difficult all the way through the process, and I was like, he's just not getting on board, what's going on? And it was a big learning moment for me, because I thought, oh yeah, I was so busy trying to fill 100% of the way that actually he had no room. But I also think there are other times when you've experienced it and you just think, what have I done wrong here, that this is going badly? But often you discover later down the line that person is actually just feeling very insecure about something you may not know about.
Yeah.
And it might be to do with their singing technique, it might be to do with that they hate their costume and think they're going to look awful all night, or it might be something completely else. But I think that often, when you really get at it, if a singer is feeling insecure, the first person they take that out on is normally the director, and they'll challenge you and challenge your ideas. And if you can kind of break that down, then it goes okay. But sometimes you can't, and sometimes it is just just goes badly.
Harriet?
No, I don't.
Okay, that's
Sorry, that
that's
was
a
a bad
great
way
thing.
to end.
That's a great thing.
I
Yeah.
don't feel like I'm at liberty to disclose as an assistant. Do you know what I mean?
Sorry?
I don't feel quite as at liberty to disclose what you come up against as an assistant.
Oh no, you've got to include your assisting experiences too. Next time. Tell us about the kind of director that you would like to be.
I think that, I mean, it's sort of the kind of person I want to be, but I think I want to be a director with integrity. And I think I mean that about what I was describing earlier in terms of process and coming up with a concept and thinking through something, having a very instinctive and truthful response to the piece that does manage to drown out what you think other people are going to think, how you think it's going to be received, anything you think you should be doing. But then I think in the process, I think you have to display great integrity I guess in all there are so many relationships you have as a director, and it is a role of leadership, and I think that that has a great responsibility to it, and I like to think that I would create a really open, warm space, but one that is very truthful, and that it's a slightly tricky thing to describe, but I think I guess being truthful to my own values and sticking with them even through all the myriad complexities that a rehearsal process brings up, I guess.
Adele.
I think I've kind of seen a trend in younger directors whereby, not these two, but there's a kind of, you can see that there's a lack of confidence in being really brave and bold and having a really personal and individual voice. And I think that has come around because, you know, it's very well publicised now, but there's been a long-term funding crisis in the arts in the UK. And when a country is feeling insecure, the first thing that it kicks out against is its arts community. And I think what I see from younger artists is a desire to please and a desire to kind of replicate what has gone before. And very recently, the playwright Edward Bond died. And I was thinking a lot about his death, and it was very profound, his death for me. I'd studied him when I was at university. He lived around the corner from my university, so I tried to go on a hunt to find him when I was at university unsuccessfully. And his first play was a play called Early Morning for the Royal Court. I think I've got that right. Maybe it wasn't Early Morning. No, The Pope's Wedding. Sorry, the Pope's Wedding, The Impossible Act. And in the play, a young boy who's recognisable from Edward Bond's early plays, a young kind of working class boy, comes across a house, and in the house there's a kind of shuffling, strange man, and suddenly the play stops being kind of dialogue, fast-paced dialogue and contemporary dialogue, and it becomes these very long stage directions. And the directions are stuff like the man shuffles 3 paces, he stops, he pauses, he turns, he breathes, he shuffles. And what's happening is that Edward Bond is parodying Samuel Beckett being the kind of dominant playwright before Edward Bond's time. And that boy that Edward Bond writes through the play becomes interested in this old man, and then eventually he bludgeons him to death in a really violent scene. And I guess what I would want for all directors is the confidence to go to the generation before them, thank you so much, but please fuck off. Because there's something essential that we have a voice as a generation. And I guess I would only want to be brave enough to keep that spirit of the new alive, and that's all I want for myself as a director. And I want it for younger directors as well, to feel confident to go, this is who I am.
Do you think that there's a danger that the younger generation of directors are being affected by almost a new orthodoxy?
Absolutely.
In terms of approach? Totally.
And I think something is happening within the UK where, because of this lack of confidence, I think there's safety in homogeny. So I think all the opera I see and all the theatre I see is becoming slowly more homogenous, which for a very small demographic of the UK is exactly what they want to see as an audience. But I think for the wider UK, I think that there are more voices. And funnily enough, what's really interesting is when I work out what is it I can't buy a ticket for because it's sold out. it'll be something like the incredible Dorian Gray in the West End at the moment, which is an Australian show. But it will often be those shows at the National, which are written by black writers, for example. Try getting a ticket for Nine Night when it was on. It was impossible. Try getting a ticket for Barbershop Quartet. So there's an appetite for these new voices, that we have new voices. These are old voices, but they're new on the London stages. And yet, that's not quite marrying up, I think, with the mainstream, if that makes sense. So I just would love the younger generation to be instilled with confidence not to follow the orthodoxy, like you say.
Harriet, as a member of the younger generation, what's your perspective on what
Having
Adele
seen
said?
the design for Full Moon in March, do you think we're in danger of conforming to orthodoxy? I don't feel that. I think it's quite a privilege to be a young woman given an opportunity to work in a place like the Royal Opera House, where the relationship to the past and to the canon is very present. And I feel like in many ways I'm here in order to be different or be ever so slightly provocative, or to keep the folks that I'm working with and interacting with questioning. I feel encouraged to do that by you, Ollie, and by the folks that I work with here. So actually, I don't feel, and I think that's, like I said, it's a privilege. I think there's resource here for me to feel safe in my work while also being encouraged to be a slightly progressive, a little bit rebellious voice. So no, I feel all right. I think if you said we're people pleasers, though, and I was thinking about my answer for what kind of director I want to be, and I thought I'd love to be the kind of director that the singers and the administration of an opera house were equally joyful to have come back, because I think sometimes I've observed a little bit of one or the otherness. But I'd love to be someone that everyone was like, oh wow, I'm so glad she's coming back to the opera house. Mm-hmm. It'll be exciting, fun work, but also she'll have her poop in a pile, and we don't have to worry too much about what she's going to get up to.
We've got about 3 minutes left before we take some questions from the audience. Just very briefly, can I just ask each of you to talk about your proudest moment so far as a director?
No, I can't go first. I love all my babies.
I don't know. I think in some ways, which I hope isn't a cliche answer, but sometimes I think of when I was doing my master's in theatre directing and we were making work all the time, and you don't have any time to think. So you are going on instinct, and you're making stuff that you would never let yourself do if you thought too hard about it or if you worried too much about the pressure. So I think I feel proud of kind of being brave enough to go there. But I also think, in a funny way, I think my doing, which was for a live stream, the Seven Deadly Sins and Mahagoni Songspiel that I did here, that Harriet and I worked on together, because it was for a live stream, and I was lucky enough to work with an incredible design team. Lizzie Clahan was the designer, but I think that we had to think outside the box, and I do think I feel very proud of really going there with her and all the torturous Zoom calls we had, kind of.
This is during COVID, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So it was during COVID, and so didn't have a live audience, and it was only live streamed. And I mean, in many ways, I have Lizzie to thank. She was so brilliant. But I think I feel proud of being really brave, actually, and doing something that might not come off. And I think you're right to say, of course, actually being brave is also a kind of director I want to be. And I do feel proud of taking the risks that we took on that show, actually. Yeah.
Rightly so. Harriet?
I think one of mine is coming up, being on the Etta Parker program, you spend a lot of time assisting folks on the main stage, and it sort of culminates in getting to direct a piece in the Linbury. And aside from sort of being gobsmacked that anyone has allowed me to find myself in this position, I'm actually really proud and excited for what I think the next couple weeks are going to feel like, because I didn't know 2 years ago I'd be directing an opera at all, much less one here. So that's pretty great.
Adele?
When I was in school, the teacher, what's it called, the job person, what are they called? The
careers advisor.
Careers advisor, yeah.
Counselor,
came in and they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I'm going to be an artist. And our school was right opposite the steelworks. And they pointed at the steelworks and they went, that's where you'll work. So I'm just really proud that I'm actually I am an artist and I can kind of go into that career supervisor.
Well done, Adele. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for your brilliant answers. It's been fascinating. I would like to open up this discussion now to you in the audience, for those of you who have questions. So please raise your hands, and if you can wait until the microphone has reached you, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Good to see you finally.
Hi, thank you so much for your illuminations. I was speaking to a friend of mine today who works in our business, and told him I was coming tonight, and he laughed and said something to the effect that nobody needs bad directors, but good directors are essential. I would like to hear your four views on why the turkey count in the British opera scene has been so high over the last 25 years. Why is there so much bad stuff put on the stage?
Ollie?
That's a really good question.
Except to the Royal Opera House.
Yeah,
of course.
That includes the Opera House.
Well, all of these things are subjective, of course, and no, it sounds like a politician's answer, but it's true. That one person's turkey might be another person's favourite show of their entire lives. A very good example is the Barry Kosky production of Carmen, which I'm sure many of you will have seen, which preceded the one that opened last week. And for many people, it was the most exciting, refreshing Carmen that they had ever seen and are likely to see. There were also members of the audience who did not think that, and had a particular objection to certain moments in the show. And I think that's great, that the fact that there are these, these enormous ranges of opinion over the same show. I think that's true. But look, there's no guarantees when you put on an opera production that it's going to be as good as you might want, or when you commission an opera production, because that's not the way that live art works. What you can do is entrust, someone in my position, entrust a director with opera that you believe in, that you think they're going to be able to dedicate their life and soul to, and make something which an audience will love. But they are always leaps of faith. That's just inevitable, as it is a leap of faith when you direct for yourself, I think it's fair to say. But guys, I don't know if you have a response to this gentleman's question.
Well, I think, it's really interesting. I'm a film obsessive, and also I'm just a music obsessive. So there are loads of albums that maybe didn't do very well in the 60s that then got massive in the 90s. Like The Doors are a really good example. When I talk to my dad about The Doors, he's always like, "Oh, The Doors were rubbish." And I love, and then our generation grew up loving The Doors. Live art exists only in the moment. So what it doesn't get the opportunity to do is to then go into a bargain bin on a DVD and be found and reclaimed 30 years later by a different generation. So part of the issue, I think, is what we kind of started talking about earlier on. You're absolutely right, Ollie, that there's no such thing as a good or a bad show, really. Sarah Kane was slandered by the press when she started as a playwright, and she's the most important playwright of the last 100 years, probably, in the UK. But what live art doesn't have is that kind of the possibility of a life. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because a playwright's play could be rediscovered 100 years later, and the score could be discovered 100 years later, but the director is probably the only artistic role that it only exists in that moment. And if for whatever reason the audience that it's made for don't come, then it might be perceived as being bad, but there's no such thing. And also, for the record, I thought that Carmen was fantastic.
There you go.
It's actually, funny enough, more an observation than a question. And then I'll leave you to go from the observation, perhaps, what the question should be. It's noticeable to me, at any rate, that the three of you are young and the three of you are women. And I just wonder what your response is to that observation. I doubt if this was held 30 years ago, you having an interview with three directors, there would have been three young women there. So I'd just be interested in your response to that observation.
Well, we actually talked about this beforehand and saying how delighted we were that we were told a little bit about the event beforehand, and that it didn't come up, and that I think I would have maybe 10 years ago thought differently, and I would have thought I must talk about the fact of gender or whatever. But actually, it's also kind of rather wonderful, and that it doesn't have to be a thing, and that can be kind of much more normal. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Ollie's also young, I would add.
Well, thank you. God bless you.
Really good skincare.
Pay you later.
You are telling people what to do, aren't you, as director?
Yeah.
Taking control. So how do you feel about imposing? You said there was a degree of collaboration, but ultimately you're trying to impose your view on
Yeah.
people.
Has that got anything to do with gender, that you're asking that second part of the question?
Well, if you felt that's
I don't. When I tell people what to do, I don't think I'm a woman and I'm telling them what to do.
Yeah.
I just tell them what to do. But I think occasionally I notice that sometimes if I'm directing older men, it takes longer for me to earn their trust. That I need to prove that I am excellent before they're prepared to do something that I ask them to do. But in general, I think it's one of the reasons I like the job is that, we're in the business of complexity, and if somebody wants to think of my gender too hard, then they're not working hard enough, because they shouldn't have that much brain space.
Yeah, to be honest, they're professionals, and they get on with the work. I think the perception of gender, and that somehow there'll be a problem, is very outside the rehearsal room rather than in it, I think. Myself.
Next question.
Hi. I was wondering if you'd have any advice for theatre directors looking to segue into opera?
Go and see as much of it as you can. Talk to Ollie. Just make anything that you can. I mean, it's funny, when I started directing, I'm sure Ollie was probably around the same time that you started directing, I would imagine. You could, when you were a young director, you could get like a small grant from the Arts Council very easily, very administratively light. Yeah. You could also go on the dole, and you could get a lot of other people who are on the dole together, and you can make something, and you could just keep making work. Now, it's much harder today to make work for young directors, because the resources you need as a director are quite massive. You can get up and paint a painting, and my boyfriend's a pianist. He can play the piano every day of his life, but I can't wake up in the morning and go, right, come on, can I have 5 or 6 people and some stage managers and just kind of go make something? Because my boyfriend stopped responding to that. So I think just make as much as you possibly can. That, I think, is the key to it. If you can do anything, just keep making, because it's in the making of the work that you'll know if you want to make it or not. Opera singers are not terrifying. Get them together, go and work with them, get them in a room, just try it. Just make stuff. I know that sounds awful, but...
Harriet, have you got any thoughts on that?
I would disavow yourself of the premise that the skills you have as a theater director are not a lot of the same skills you need as an opera director. I think especially with the kind of the culture of younger opera singers and the work that I'm being invited to, the fact that I have a background in theater is actually an asset. It's not like, oh, I should transform into some version of myself that was an opera girly instead. Like, it's not. I am what I am, and those skills have a place. I think if you're, looking for tasks to undertake that will make you feel like you're making progress, like, you don't have to speak Italian, but practice saying it out loud, and go and watch opera. And the Yetta Parker program do have sort of trainings and schemes, and I'm sure other companies like it. There is sort of a lot more space in these big institutions to observe like opera processes. I think that's an amazing thing to do, to just watch opera directors work. Those would be my suggestions, but like, you don't need to be different than you actually are.
What role do you think you have in making sure that opera doesn't die?
Good question.
I think we have to make really good work. I think, and we'll all do that in really different ways. Everyone will do that. But I think, and like you were saying earlier, we have to trust it. We have to love it. And I don't think people should be directing opera who don't love it.
Yeah.
And I think we need to just really go for it and make the work as good as we can, actually.
I think making the buildings that house opera feel really welcoming is something that would go a really long way to making, to cultivating an audience who is young and still has many years left to love opera. I think feeling welcome in these spaces and, I can't tell you how many friends of mine or folks who are from my theater life who I've sort of been like, oh, have you come to anything at the Opera House? And they say stuff like, I don't have a tuxedo. It's like, but I spent my first job assisting Izzy. I had a pair of denim dungarees that I usually work in, and I wasn't positive I was allowed to wear denim working at the Royal Opera House, so I didn't the whole time. Do you know what I mean? Like, those may sound obvious to those of us who love this building and feel really welcome here and spend a lot of time in it and know it has like the best AC and free bathrooms of anywhere in Covent Garden in the summertime. But you'd probably be surprised how few people, especially young folks who are from or live in London, are aware of how much this space can serve them or is willing to have them present in it. And so I think there's actually a responsibility to be clearer and much more vocal about inviting younger audiences into the work, because I do think they more often than not enjoy it and are surprised to enjoy it in spite of this kind of like glass bubble that seems to exist around it.
Completely right, yeah. Have any more questions?
When a house appoints a director, is there ever a brief given or any parameters set? Or does the director have complete artistic freedom? And can you envisage any situation where once the production started or the director identified his or her concept, that the house would consider it so offensive or controversial that they would actually say they were not prepared to proceed with it?
I'm pretty sure that's happened. No, I don't know where, but I definitely heard plenty of stories along the way where concepts have been quietly told that, that actually is maybe too risky or not quite right, or have you considered this? I mean, not in that context, but my first show here as a young artist, and we came up with a concept, but actually it was a little bit similar to a concept of another show in the same season. So we and on your advice, we adjusted. So that did actually happen. But I also think it totally depends on the artistic director, actually, on how involved they are or how hands off.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go on, Ollie.
No, I was just going to say that in answer to the first part of your question, yes, you will sometimes give a very general brief to a director, particularly if it's a piece of classic repertoire, where the expectations are that little bit different in a place like this in particular. But on the other hand, you would never want to constrain a director by saying it's got to be like this, or it's got to be classic, it's got to be traditional. That would not be helpful. But certainly just in terms of the atmosphere and what you want the audience to feel at the end of it, I think it's good, especially maybe it's helpful actually sometimes being a director, that you can have that one-to-one conversation, which is just very open. But that's the initial offer to a director is the most important moment, because you're investing a huge amount of trust in them to deliver a project which will probably have an enormous amount of resource, time, money behind it. And particularly where it's under such a high level of scrutiny as it will inevitably be here, that you're going to need to feel quite sure that they're the right person for the job. And certainly I've never been in a situation where I've thought, this person is terrible, I've made a terrible mistake, and we need to cancel the production.
That's good.
Yeah.
But the process of like coming up with the concept and working with the house is that you might get off, like it's a very long time basically, so you might work on it conceptually for like 2 years or something before the show actually happens. And so at the point of taking that job, there would be a conversation, let's say between me and Ollie, and then I would go away and think about it, let's say with my designer, we'd work very hard, but then we would come probably pre-white card, we'd come to Ollie and let Ollie know what the idea is, and then if he thinks that's a good idea, that's fine to go ahead, then we'll do what's called a white card model showing, which is you present the show, but you don't make a finished model of what everything will look like. It's made in white card or black card. It's any color, but it's like, it's not a finished model, it's just an idea. Then you work through the whole of that together. At that stage, usually if there's anything that needs tweaking, you will talk about it with the intendant or artistic director. And then you have what's called the final model showing, whereby then you've worked out hopefully all of those kinks, and then you show it again, and then that's where the last kinks will get ironed out. So the idea of something then getting to halfway through rehearsals and being pulled is kind of, would be very weird, because it would be patently clear where the show is headed, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which is why I think we don't see, lots of shows. But I do like the challenge of a show being too risque for it to go ahead.
Well, I think we've got time for one more question.
Is it on? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thank you so much for your time and insight to all four of you. I wanted to ask you and go back again to the topic of music in opera, especially to the ones of you who have done theater. As you well described, now you want to pursue and show a storyline and show that to the audience. However, in opera you have music, and music plays a very big role in opera, as it's different in theater. I want to ask you, where does your job end in the music realm? Does the tempo of the music, if it goes slower, faster, also, for example, in Bel Canto di Coloratura, that it's introduced or not in the opera, where does your job end and where does the conductors begin, or the music director, I don't know, begin?
That's a very good question. Because I've done a lot of Handel, that's particularly pertinent because, of course, you have a lot of ornamentation and you've done a lot of Handel. That needs to be decided. What I've noticed is that singers increasingly, I think, of Handel repertoire they used to set all of their ornaments before they came into rehearsal, but I think now singers tend to leave that loose until they've worked through the production, so that they and the conductor can then work out how the ornament fits the moment dramatically, if that makes sense. And I think when the relationship is working really well, like working with Tony or working with Lawrence or, all those brilliant people, I mean, I've been very lucky, they've all been great, really. Then all of this will be moulded together at the same time, so it kind of feels organic. I like to spend quite a lot of time with the conductor before rehearsals because I want to know if they've got a radically different idea of a tempo, for example, and then I can go away and I can think about it and then come back and say, okay, can we halfway house it, or actually I've come up with a better idea that does suit your tempo much better. But I try not to have that many surprises, if that makes sense, when you go into the rehearsal, because it's important to me that, as you say, that all of that coloratura, or every beat of music is in complete harmony between the stage and the pit, if that makes sense. It's got to be both things at the same time.
I'm afraid that we have run out of time for this evening's Insight, but thank you all for being with us tonight. Thank you especially to our fantastic panel this evening. Thank you to all of you for being here in the Claw studio, and thanks to everyone watching online around the world. And thank you also to our sponsor Rolex for supporting this Insight. Thank you all and have a great night.
Well done.